start the countdown over because it's gonna be just a couple more minutes here. X is giving me trouble.
This is this between us.
The number one podcast in the world.
This is
the JBU.Show featuring Austin
from the Miller Talk Podcast.
ALLAN,
The American Sincerist.
and now your host,
Cam Allen.
All right, how's it going, everybody? My name is Chris, and this is the JBU.Show. Going on extremely late tonight. In fact, you will probably see an entirely different me this episode because it is after midnight here on the West Coast. I had a lot to try and get done today. I've got a video that I've been trying to put out in response to that Gillespie video on Reason that we covered on the last episode. I finally got X figured out what the problem was. That's why it took so long tonight. I apologize if you were waiting. It just refused to connect because everything changed. Long story. Anyway, it is fixed. We should be back up on X, and hopefully our reach has been returned. We will wait and see. I can't really judge by tonight. I wouldn't expect a whole lot tonight since it's after midnight, although a lot of people do seem to tune in waking up in the morning on the East Coast. So if that's you, thank you for listening. It is President's Day. Happy President's Day. Whatever that means. I'm glad that we have a day that honors our presidents and stuff. I wish we treated it more like 4th of July. I would love another reason to have fireworks. I mean, it's always been my favorite thing growing up. I grew up right in the middle of a native reservation. There was like one street in the middle that was, for whatever reason, part of the city that I lived in and not part of the reservation, even though it was right in the center. So all of the fireworks stands were right down at the end of the block, and every year we would work for the neighbors and stuff to make money to go down there, and they would give us fireworks too. And it's always been a big part of 4th of July for us. But I'm glad that my son likes them as much as I did, because I don't know what I would have done if he didn't. It would have been very upsetting. But I guess in honor of President's Day, we're going to take a look at one of the best presidents of the 20th century, Calvin Coolidge, and do something a little different tonight. We're just going to talk about the United States and probably a little bit about men and conservatives. What should you be doing right now? Where exactly are we at? We're kind of in this point of, it's not complacency. We're in a point of, what do we do now sort of thing. Because Trump has not exactly been as great as we would have hoped, but not bad. I mean, he's certainly, not what the left claims. And he is doing a good job, and I try not to put too much on him because I try to remember, what he's up against too, which is unprecedented for any president. But at the same time, it's hard not to be disappointed. Really less in President Trump and more in Congress. But we have an election coming up for that, so of course that's going to be very important. But there's still a lot on the line, and there's still a lot that nothing's really been fixed yet. And that's the problem. Not permanently. There have been no serious changes. And we just seem to continue to grow farther and farther apart as far as a nation. So I don't know. I think there's a lot of different things we can get into, and the way that I want to do that is by reading a little bit from Calvin Coolidge, who I believe is the greatest president of the 20th century, and kind of use that, I guess, as a jumping off point. And of course, there are some other things that we'll have to get into as well. Anyway, give me just a second here while I get organized. So I had to redact a lot of this speech. This is his first address to Congress as president. Now, if you're unaware, Calvin Coolidge did not become president via election the first time. He became president because he was vice president for President Harding, who died, and I believe was the first president to die in office. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure. Or die while holding office. And, well, first and maybe only even. I can't think of another one. Anyway, it was a very long speech. And the first thing that stands out about that is not that the speech was long, it's what it was discussed. It was literally a list, almost like a shopping list, of all of these different things that he felt needed addressed in the country, because he was treating his job as if he was a civil servant, not as if he had just won a rock star competition like modern presidents do. And that was nice. It was just a interesting, like, juxtaposition, and it was nice to see that at least at some point in time our politicians actually gave a crap about this country and the people in it. So I redacted a lot of it anyway, is the point that I'm getting to, because we obviously can't talk about all. I mean, it probably took him 20 minutes to deliver, and it would take me at least that long. And there's actually things about it I want to talk about. So, let's just dive in. I highlighted certain portions. That's what we're going to read. If you want to read the rest of it, you can go to CoolidgeFoundation.org. They get all of its speeches and all that stuff there. Sorry, guys. Like I said, you're going to get a different me tonight. I am tired. I've had a long day, but I didn't want to go 2 days in a row on the 3 days a week we're supposed to be streaming and not put anything up. I guess technically I did, since it's after midnight. All right. This address, like I said, was before Congress in 1923. I guess this would be the State of the Union in 1923. Since the close of the last Congress, the nation has lost President Harding. The world knew his kindness and his humanity, his greatness and his character. He has left his mark upon history. He has made justice more certain and peace more secure. The surpassing tribute paid to his memory as he was borne across the continent to rest at last at home, revealed the place lie held in the hearts of the American people. But this is not the occasion for extended reference. I assume that's supposed to say reverence, to the man or to his work. In this presence, among those who knew and loved him, that is unnecessary. But we who were associated with him could not resume together the functions of our office without pausing for a moment, and in his memory reconsecrating ourselves to the service of our country. He is gone. We remain. It is our duty, under the inspiration of his example, to take up the burdens which he was permitted to lay down, and to develop and support the wise principles of government which he represented. So some nice opening words, of course, for Harding there. He immediately moves into foreign affairs. For us, peace reigns everywhere. We desire to perpetuate it always by granting full justice to others and requiring of others full justice to ourselves. Our country has one cardinal principle to maintain in its foreign policy. It is an American principle. It must be an American policy. We attend to our own affairs, conserve our own strength, and protect the interests of our own citizens. But we recognize thoroughly our obligation to help others, reserving to the decision of our own judgment the time, the place, and the method. We realize the common bond of humanity. We know the inescapable law of service. Our country has definitely refused, or rather defiantly refused, to adopt and ratify the Covenant of the League of Nations. We have not felt warranted in assuming the responsibilities which its members have assumed. I am not proposing any change in this policy, neither is the Senate. The incident, so far as we are concerned, is closed. The League exists as a foreign agency. We hope it will be helpful, but the United States sees no reason to limit its own freedom and independence of action by joining it. We shall do well to recognize this fact in all national affairs and govern ourselves accordingly. Now, from there, we move on farther, but I do have to note that he says that about the League of Nations to, in the very next paragraph, go on and argue for a world court. And look, if you haven't read a lot of American history, but you know enough about it that you certainly agree more with former politicians, let's say, than modern politicians, you might be disappointed to read some words that they have written. I have been before, especially when reading the Federalist Papers and such. Now, part of that comes from Hamilton, who I just don't like in general. But not that he never said anything good. Of course he did. But there's certain things about his personality type that I think made for a bad politician. He had a lot of blind spots, we'll put it that way. But it's important to remember, too, the first time I heard Jefferson arguing for a federal government, I was kind of disappointed. But you got to remember, too, that the times were entirely different as far as our government structure was concerned. I certainly wouldn't argue today that we should have no federal government, and that was what was going on at the time. There was no federal government, so it made sense to be arguing for a federal government. And the same thing here. I wholly agree with the statement that I read from Coolidge. And then he goes on to contradict himself. Of course, he didn't think so, obviously, but he goes on to contradict himself with the word world court exactly one paragraph later. It's a little disappointing to read, there's no doubt about it. But at the same time, he doesn't have the benefit of the next 100 years of hindsight that we have. And so you got to remember that as well. And it's also why it's important not to hold up Calvin Coolidge by far is one of America's greatest presidents. That doesn't mean he never made a mistake. And to me, credibility is, I don't want to say everything, but it is of the utmost importance. And so it's important when we're talking about these things not to talk in complete absolutes as far as everything Calvin Coolidge did, or everything Thomas Jefferson did, or everything Benjamin Franklin did was perfect, because they weren't. Anyway, and it's okay to, I think the other thing I would add to that is it's okay to recognize that and to, you're not being hypocritical in using your judgment over how something turned out just because that person was in favor of it and you now oppose it, or vice versa. We have the benefit of seeing how certain things happen. Some ideas don't turn out good. Anyway, that might have been a pep talk just for myself, but it is something that crosses my mind. I did highlight one sentence that he said while arguing for the World Court, just because I liked it. Partisanship has no place in our foreign relations. All right, so now he moves on to what he titled Fiscal Condition. Economics, basically. Our main problems are domestic problems. Financial stability is the first requisite of sound government. We cannot escape the effect of world conditions. We cannot avoid the inevitable results of the economic disorder which have reached all nations. But we shall diminish their harm to us in proportion as we continue to restore our government finances to secure an endurable position. This we can and must do. Upon that firm foundation rests the only hope of progress and prosperity. From that source must come relief for the people. This is being accomplished by a drastic but orderly retrenchment, which is bringing our expenses within our means. The origin of this has been the determination of the American people. The main support has been the courage of those in its authority, and the effective method has been the budget system. The result has involved real sacrifice by department heads, but it has been made without flinching. This system is a law of the Congress. It represents your will. It must be maintained and ought to be strengthened by the example of your observance. Without a budget system, there can be no fixed responsibility and no constructive scientific economy. Gee, we seem to have forgotten those words, haven't we? This great concentration of effort by the administration and Congress has brought the expenditures, exclusive of the self-supporting Post Office Department, down to $3 billion. It is possible, in consequence, to make a larger reduction in the taxes of the people, which is the sole object of all curtailment. This is treated at greater length in the budget message, and a proposed plan has been presented in detail in a statement by the Secretary of Treasury, which has my unqualified approval. I especially commend a decrease on earned incomes. He should have, in my opinion, argued to overturn that law. And I think that's sort of what he is going to go on to argue for here, but he doesn't say it outright, and he should have. It wasn't the first time that there was an income tax, but it was the first time there was an income tax for the point of taxing wealth and with the intent of it remaining permanent. There was never a permanent income tax in the history of the United States. Before 1916, there was never a permanent tax. Most Americans live most of their lives paying no sales or income tax. It's not that they paid no taxes, obviously, but they paid no income tax. And you know, one thing I didn't do was look up. Brought the expenditures exclusive of, okay, down to $3 billion. What would $3 billion be today? Let's see. How much is $3 billion in 1923 dollars in 2026 dollars? This is probably going to make me mad. Wow. Wow. I kind of wish I didn't redact the whole speech now because it's impressive how much the government itself was doing. Do you know how much $3 billion in 1923 dollars is in 26 dollars? $56 billion. $56 billion. That is 1/100th of the current budget. It's less than that. I don't know how much less. I'm not going to do the math. It's a tiny fraction of the current budget. Remember, we're in the trillions. This is less than 100 billion, half of 100 billion. We're at like almost $7 trillion a year. And if we stayed on the same budget that the federal government had in 1923, we would be spending $56 billion a year. Even if we went with the World War I or World War II budget, that would probably only put us at about $1 trillion a year. Max. That's how much out of control our government has gotten, probably because they didn't stick to the damn budget. We have not had an actual budget in like since Calvin Coolidge's time. Yes, we had a surplus under Bill Clinton, but we didn't have an actual budget. Wow. Anyway, decrease. The amusement and educational value of moving pictures ought not to be taxed. Diminishing charges against moderate incomes from investment will afford immense relief, while the revision of the surtaxes will not only provide additional money for capital investment, thus stimulating industry and employing more labor, but will not greatly reduce the revenue from that source, and may, in fact, actually increase it. Fun fact, it did increase it. Being opposed to war taxes in time of peace, I am not in favor of excess profit taxes. A very great service could be rendered through immediate enactment of legislation relieving the people of some of the burden of taxation. To reduce war taxes is to give every home a better chance. For 7 years, the people have borne with uncomplaining courage the tremendous burden of national and local taxation. These must both be reduced. The taxes of the nation must be reduced now as much as prudence will permit, and expenditures must be reduced accordingly. And expenditures must be reduced accordingly. High taxes reach everywhere and burden everybody. They gear most heavily upon the poor. They diminish industry and commerce. They make agriculture, unprofitable. They increase the rates on transportation. They are a charge on every necessity of life. Sorry, there's a lot of things that are like misspelled here. That didn't say necessity of life. It said necessary of life. So that's why I keep tripping up. Let's see. I wanted to make a point real quick about the agricultural part of this. High taxes reach everywhere and burden everybody. Yes. They gear most heavily upon the poor. Yes. They diminish industry and commerce, and they make agriculture unprofitable. That is the worst thing we could possibly do, because of course we have to eat. Therefore, we need people to produce food and to want to produce food. Taxes on agriculture today, though, are staggering. How do we deal with this? Subsidies. And so instead of reducing the taxes, and this is how our entire government works, this is how it works with citizens too. Instead of just reducing the taxes, which provides immediate relief to the taxpayer, and yes, reduces the services from the government, but can easily be made up by the excess money you now have. You pay the taxes, and then the government takes that, they pay themselves, they pay all the people that work for the government, they borrow some of it back because they spent too much paying themselves and didn't have enough to put back into the system, and then they give you back a subsidy. In the case of agriculture, they give you back farm subsidies. Now, these are not enough to make up for the taxes you're paying in and for the regulations on top of that are costing you, for what the regulations are costing you on top of everything else. Why do they do it? Because they don't want to let go of that ability to tax. It's not about if they have to give the subsidy, they're fine giving the subsidy, especially because they're borrowing most of that against future generations. That's what our debt is. It is borrowing against our children and our children's children's taxes. You ever think about it that way? You should. Because that's exactly what it is. And even if you don't have kids, you should have a stake in America continuing. Regardless, we are borrowing all this money so that we can live beyond our means now, both in our personal lives. Generally speaking, the average American is in more debt. They don't have $500 in the bank account, all these things. All these things they should have. The average household income is $90,000 a year now. It was only $55,000 5 years ago. Well, a little more than that. Like 8 years ago now. Aside from that, there was another point there. Oh, federally, we're living beyond our means too. And that will, just because it hasn't come back to bite us in the ass doesn't mean it's not going to. It has to. We are now paying over $1 trillion a year just on interest. That's literal money we're just throwing away. And you know how Congress is making up for that? Because now $1 trillion, the interest is so high, it's taking $1 trillion out of the $4 trillion budget that they bring in. We pay about $4 trillion in taxes between all taxes collected that go to the federal government. Now, they can only spend $3 trillion of it because $1 trillion goes to just paying interest, not paying down, paying interest on the debt. So they borrow $2 trillion instead of borrowing $1 trillion to make up for that extra missing trillion. And actually, they're borrowing closer to $3 trillion, I believe. Or no, it's back down to 2. Biden proposed borrowing $3 trillion for this year. It has to stop. The only way that we can do this is by turning over more of the federal government back to the private sector. We have to. Let me read a little more before I get into my grander pitch here. But we talk about all the time, what is it that we want to do as a nation? What is it that we want to do as conservatives? What is it we actually want to see going forward? Keep that in mind as we keep reading here. Of all services which the Congress can render to the country, I have no hesitation in declaring to neglect it, to postpone it, to obstruct it by unsound proposals is to become unworthy of public confidence and untrue to public trust. The country wants this measure to have the right of way over all others. Another reform which is urgent in our fiscal system is the abolition of the right to issue tax-exempt securities. The existing system not only permits a large amount of wealth of the nation to escape its just burden, but acts as a continual stimulant to municipal extravagance. This should be prohibited by the constitutional amendment. All the wealth of the nation ought to contribute its fair share to the expense of the nation. What he's talking about there is essentially states where they weren't borrowing money, but they were offering tax-free securities, which allowed them essentially to borrow money because they were going to have to pay that money back later. And they were doing that based on investing in profits from their business sectors. It was basically the same thing. Like in a roundabout way, it is basically the same thing. They were borrowing debt in order to live beyond their means, in a sense, without giving their fair share to the federal government. The entire well-being of our country. Oh, we're on to shipping now, by the way. The entire well-being of our country is dependent upon transportation by sea and by land. Our government during the war acquired a large merchant fleet, which should be transferred as soon as possible to private ownership and operation under conditions which would secure two results. First, and of prime importance, adequate means for national defense. Second, adequate service to American commerce. Until shipping conditions are such that our fleet can be disposed of advantageously under these conditions, it will be operated as economically as possible under such plans as may be devised from time to time by the shipping board. We must have a merchant marine which meets these requirements, and we shall have to pay the cost of its service. I don't think anyone's opposed to that, even today, right? When there is something that is a necessity for the country to have, it's fine that the government perpetuate it. But if the government need not be the entity that perpetuates it, if private business is more than capable of taking care of it, even with some conditions, like ensuring that a proper fleet is maintained in case of war, things like that, then private business should do that, because that is always going to be more cost effective. We don't have to pay taxes for it if it's private business, guys. Isn't that amazing? Like, we get the same service out of it, and we don't have to pay taxes for it. It's a crazy concept. Yes, some guy might get rich off of doing it. You don't have to pay taxes for it. I don't understand what's so hard to understand about that. Excuse me just 1 second here. One of these days I'll be completely over this cold. Criticism of the railroads, moving on to railroads. Criticism of the railroad law has been directed first to the section laying down the rule by which rates are fixed, and providing for payment to the government and use of excess earnings, second to the method for adjustment of wage scales, and third to the authority permitting consolidations. It has been erroneously assumed that the Act undertakes to guarantee railroad earnings. The law requires that rates should be just and reasonable. That has always been the rule under which the rates have been fixed. To make a rate that does not yield a fair return results in confiscation, and confiscatory rates are, of course, unconstitutional. Unless the government adheres to the rulemaking, a rate that will yield a fair return, it must abandon rate making altogether. Prisons. The national government has never given adequate attention to its prison problem. It ought to provide employment in such forms of production as can be used by the government, though not sold to the public in competition with private businesses, or all prisoners who can be placed at work and for which they should receive a reasonable compensation available for their dependents. Why don't we still do this? First of all, I firmly believe that the criminals that can be, because I understand not everybody in a prison, certainly not maximum security prison, can be put to work, right? I get that. But the criminals that can be absolutely should be, to cover the cost of their own labor first, and then also to be able to have a way to do nothing more than provide for their dependents. Whatever their rate that a judge determines is owed for CPS, that's how much they should be able to earn. Not CPS, but child care. What is it called? Child support, rather. Whatever a judge determines they should owe for child support, since they are no longer in the home, right? They should be able to earn at least that much. Not, and maybe a little bit more for themselves for a small boost in their quality of living in jail from the cantina or whatever. I'm not a huge fan of giving them things that just make them easier to watch, like TV. Prison's not supposed to be fun, but giving them a purpose and the ability to be productive members of society by taking care of their own dependents first is absolutely good business, not to mention providing labor to pay for their incarceration rather than the taxpayers having to do it at sole expense. We talk all the time about what's fair to prisoners. What's fair to taxpayers? For us just to pay for them to sit around and watch TV? That doesn't seem very just. We have to get up and go to work every day. Maybe they should too. Okay, I might stumble in this section a little bit because obviously the word that they use to refer to the black community is not one I'm about to use. I guess I could since we're only on X and no, it's not the N word, but it's the other N word. But I just, I'm not one of those people that goes out of my way to say unnecessary things. I don't necessarily have a problem with it. I'm just not one to do it. So anyway, if I stumble a couple times, that might be why. Numbered among our population are some 12 million people. He's talking about black people. There are some 12 million black people. Under our Constitution, see, that's a good example because I redacted it, so it's blank. So anyway, under our Constitution, their rights are just as sacred as those of any other citizen. Keep in mind, this is 1923. This is the time when we're told Americans, and especially conservative Americans, which of course Coolidge was a Republican, were at their peak racist. Numbered among our population are some 12 million black people. Under our Constitution, their rights are just as sacred as those of any other citizen. It is both a public and a private duty to protect those rights. The Congress ought to exercise all its powers of prevention and punishment against the hideous crime of lynching, of which black Americans are by no means the sole sufferers, but for which they furnish a majority of the victims. Already, for anybody unaware, nearly as many white people were lynched as black Americans. Not that it matters, but it does when people are going around claiming that it was, this thing that it wasn't. It was an atrocious crime that was committed many, many hundreds of times. But it was not something that was universal across the nation anytime white people came across a black man. There were 12 million black Americans at this time. By 1920, there had maybe been a few thousand. Maybe a few, meaning 3,000 lynchings. I can't remember the exact number offhand, but I know it's in the single-digit thousands. It was not anything. To compare that, there are, well, I can tell you off the top of my head, there's 46,000 annual deaths from firearms, roughly, somewhere in there. There are 26,000 annual suicide deaths solely from firearms. Annual. I'm talking about 3, maybe 5,000 at the absolute most lynchings over the course of 50, 60 years, from the end of the Civil War till around this time. It goes on a little bit longer. But, which is not to say it was not a horrible, atrocious crime committed by the Democrat progressive KKK. Which again, Democrat would be entirely unnecessary to mention, except for the fact they keep trying to change the language and the history. It was a hideous problem. But it was not a universal problem. It was not a universal flaw in the American people. Or let alone the American system. This is the President of the United States at the time calling it out. Already, a considerable sum is appropriated to give Black Americans vocational training in agriculture. About $500,000 is recommended for medical courses at Howard University to help contribute to the education of no less than 500 Black doctors needed each year. But I thought we've never done anything for the Black community. We've been doing it the whole time. The whole time since the end of the Civil War. And then, there was that whole thing about fighting our own brothers for their freedom in the Civil War, but that was no big deal. On account of the integration of large numbers into industrial centers, it has been proposed that a commission be created, composed of members from both races, to formulate a better policy for mutual understanding and confidence. Such an effort is to be commended. Everyone would rejoice in the accomplishment of the result which it seeks, but it is well to recognize that these difficulties are to a large extent local problems which must be worked out by the mutual forbearance and human kindness of each community. Such a method gives much more promise of a real remedy than outside interference. Boy, have we seen that over the last 125 years. 100 years, I guess. Education and welfare. Our national government is not doing as much as it legitimately can to promote the welfare of the people. Our enormous material wealth, our institutions, our whole form of society cannot be considered fully successful until their benefits reach the merit of every individual. This is not a suggestion that government should or could assume for the people the inevitable burdens of existence. There is no method by which we can either be relieved of the results of our own folly or to be guaranteed a successful life. There is an inescapable personal responsibility for the development of character, of industry, of thrift, and of self-control. These things do not come from government. They come from the people themselves. But the government can and should always be expressive of steadfast determination, always vigilant to maintain conditions under which these virtues are most likely to develop and secure recognition and reward. This is American policy. It is in accordance with this principle that we have enacted laws for the protection of the public health and have adopted prohibition in narcotic drugs. For purposes of a national uniformity, we ought to provide by constitutional amendment in appropriate legislation a former limitation of child labor, and in all cases under exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government, a minimum wage law for women, which would undoubtedly find sufficient power of enforcement in the influence of public opinion. Meaning they should suggest a minimum wage, not enforce one, and public opinion alone will ensure that it is enacted. Yeah. Having in mind that education is peculiarly a local problem. Okay, let's make sure I didn't skip a paragraph. And that it should always be pursued with the largest freedom of choice by students and parents. Nevertheless, the federal government might well give the benefit of its counsel and encouragement more freely in this direction. If anyone doubts the need of concerted action by the states of the nation for this purpose, it is only necessary to consider the appalling figures of illiteracy representing a condition which does not vary much in all parts of the Union. Mere intelligence is not enough. Enlightenment must be accompanied by that moral power which is the product of the home and of religion. Real education and true welfare for the people rest inevitably on this foundation, which the government can approve and commend, but which the people themselves must create. Immigration. American institutions rest solely on good citizenship. They were created by people who had a background of self-government. New arrivals should be limited to our capacity to absorb them into the ranks of good citizenship. America must be kept American. For this purpose, it is necessary to continue a policy of restricted immigration. It would be well to make such immigration of a selective nature with some inspection at the source, and based either on a prior census or upon the record of naturalization. Either method would ensure the admission of those with the largest capacity and best intention of becoming citizens. I am convinced that our present economic and social conditions warrant a limitation of those to be admitted. This is after progressives from 1900 to 1920, the first progressive era. This is after they instituted the first ever waves of mass migration. Harding, followed by Coolidge, put an end to that and said, look, we can't just allow anybody and everybody in without any assurities, without any ability for them to take care of themselves. Much like we're seeing today, basically. Progressives, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, even George Bush, Bill Clinton, allowed many migrants in. And yes, all three of those presidents I just mentioned, besides Biden, did deport more people. But that's because they were letting in more people too, so there were more criminals to deport. They did the bare minimum of deporting at least the criminals, which you should at least do. And so they had more deportations because they were letting more people in too. Donald Trump is the first president in the 21st century to actually slow down the illegal immigration, or try and stop it, rather, the illegal immigration, focus only on the legal immigration, and deport everybody that's here illegally, which is where we're at now, of course, and is highly contested. We should find additional safety in a law requiring the immediate registration of all aliens. Those who do not want to be partakers in the American spirit ought not to settle in America. He has several paragraphs here about veterans, all of which are good, but I'm only going to read the first two because they're all under the same point. They're more to like specifics of the time rather than general statements. No more important duty falls on the government of the United States than the adequate care of its veterans. Those suffering disabilities incurred in the service must have sufficient hospital relief and compensation. Their dependents must be supported. Rehabilitation and vocational training must be completed. All of this service must be clean, must be prompt, and must be effective. And it must be administered in a spirit of the broadest and deepest human sympathy. If investigation reveals any present defects of administration or need of legislation, orders will be given for the immediate correction of administration, and recommendations for legislation should be given the highest preference. I'm going to say something that's really controversial today. We need to be careful talking about veterans today. Anybody that has served this country in a time of war should be given the highest priority, period. Full stop, no questions asked, period. If you serve this country during a time of war, especially if you were deployed, whether combat zone or not, no questions asked. However, progressives have utilized our military for many years now as a training ground of sorts to try and get anybody that they can that didn't go through the radicalized college system, they tried to radicalize the military to pick up as many more people as possible, as well as to help immigrate as many people as possible through that means. And look, I'm fine on the legal immigration side with allowing people to dedicate service to the U.S. military in order to gain citizenship. Obviously, we have to limit how many people can do that. But that's an okay method for me. Like, I don't see any issues there necessarily. Obviously, there are some concerns that would have to be paid attention to. But I think that that is a good way to show that you are dedicated to becoming an American. But there are a lot of leftists who are funneled through, and when I say leftists, I'm talking about radicals. I'm not talking about the average Democrat. I'm talking about radicals that were funneled into the military to get free college with basic assurity that they would never have to do anything for it and to get an easy paycheck. And they were radicalized in doing so. I've played that Navy DEI video before. I don't think I need to play it again. And thankfully, one of the priorities of the Trump administration has been fixing this and reprioritizing the military to worry itself about fighting wars and not worry about fighting woke social justice causes. But it's important to recognize that there's going to be a big difference between these people that served in peacetime and went into the military entirely for the benefits versus the people traditionally that have always gone into the military and still did during this time, but in smaller numbers, to serve their country. There's a big difference between people that enter the military to serve their country and to serve themselves. We would be wise to recognize that. That's all I'll say. Coal. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is at a time when oil is just starting to become a huge commodity. It was all coal prior to this. And obviously continue to be coal for some time. The cost of coal has become unbearably high. It places a great burden on industrial and domestic life. The public welfare requires a reduction in the price of fuel. With the enormous deposits in existence, failure of supply ought not to be tolerated. Those responsible for the conditions in this industry should undertake its reform and free it from any charge of profiteering. Profiteering is charging excess profits for no reason, basically. There is no problem. It is not communist to be against this. I'm against profiteering. I'm also against government trying to interfere in it. It's not government's place, as we're going to hear from Coolidge himself, I believe, in the next paragraph. But it is absolutely incumbent on government to put pressure on industry if they are, going down a path of following bad practices. Sure. The free market is great, but it has to be morally driven. And so it's okay to recognize that, even if we don't think government is the way to do it. And I think it's important to recognize that because when it comes to business, we're never going to bring the liberals that can be brought to back to a sane position without that. Because it is wrong for a business that is in a position of a monopoly or a de facto monopoly, because there's just not a lot of competition, to take advantage of that. They still have an obligation to the American people as an American business profiting in this country. And they ought to respect that. Just because I don't believe in the government being the ones to regulate them doesn't mean I don't believe in the people holding them accountable for it. And the government putting pressure on them even if it can't regulate them directly. The report of the Coal Commission will be before Congress. It comprises all the facts. It represents the mature deliberations and conclusions of the best talent and experience that ever made a national survey of the production and distribution of fuel. I do not favor government ownership or operation of coal mines. The need is for action under private ownership that will secure greater continuity of production and greater public protection. The federal government probably has no peacetime authority to regulate wages, prices, or profits in coal at the mines or among dealers. But by ascertaining and publishing facts, it can exercise great influence. Well said. And I think the correct mode of action. If the government can prove that, these companies are making stupid decisions that are leading to lapses in available coal on the market, or they're charging excessively high prices just for the sake of padding their wallets, the government is perfectly capable of waging what would essentially be a propaganda war, right? By issuing facts, they need to be actual facts. That has to be guided correctly too, obviously, so they're not just smearing these companies. But they have a right to issue facts and guidance on how these things can be addressed and to let the American people know, hey, these companies are doing these things. And if you don't like it, don't support them. It has been 100 years since our country announced the Monroe Doctrine. This principle has been ever since and is now one of the main foundations of our foreign relations. It must be maintained. But in maintaining it, we must not be forgetful that a great change has taken place. We are no longer a weak nation, thinking mainly of defense, dreading foreign impositions. We are a great and powerful nation. New powers bring new responsibilities. Our duty then was to protect ourselves. Added to that, our duty now is to help give stability to the world. We want idealism. We want the vision which lifts men and nations above themselves. These are virtues by reason of their own merit, but they must not be cloistered. They must not be impractical. They must not be ineffective. The world has had enough of the curse of hatred and selfishness, of destruction and war. It has had enough of the wrongful use of material power. For the healing of the nations, there must be goodwill and charity, confidence and peace. The time has come for a more practical use of moral power and more reliance upon the principle that makes its own might. Our authority among the nations must be represented by justice and by mercy. It is necessary not only to have faith, but to make sacrifices for our faith. The spiritual forces of the world make all its final determinations. It is with these voices that America should speak. Whenever they declare a righteous purpose, there need be no doubt that they will be heard. America has taken her place in the world as a republic, free, independent, powerful. The best service that can be rendered to humanity is the assurance that this place will be maintained. Boy, it would be nice to hear a speech from a president that is, and that is very reminiscent of what a lot of us hear out of Donald Trump that we appreciate. It is entirely focused on the benefit of the country and its people. And, whether or not you believe Donald Trump has made the correct moves in doing so, I don't think any honest person could deny that that is at least what he believes he's doing. Obviously, many would disagree with that, but even though I don't agree with everything he's done, I do believe that he thinks he is making the best decisions for America going forward, and I'm not sure that he's done a terrible job at it. But, I question some of the decisions to some degree. The tariffs, for example, I agree with America going back to tariffs. I think that is the correct way for us to bring in the majority of government revenue. But that has to come with reducing taxes, the income tax. We had tariffs when we didn't have the income tax. We got rid of tariffs. Good for trade, bad for American business specifically. And traded it for taxes, bad for the American people. I'm fine with going back to tariffs as the primary driver of government funds, but that has to come with a massive reduction on taxes for the people. Ideally, the abolition of income tax altogether, but I know that's out of the question, at least for now. Look, when I think back to America in a previous century, it feels like a place that can't exist anymore, where we did have true freedom, true freedom, in the sense that almost never did government interfere with the daily lives of individuals. The one exception that was mentioned here was the outlawing of drugs, which I think has been an abject failure. I've argued for this before. I'm in the minority with conservatives. I get it. Nobody has seen more firsthand than I have the devastation that decriminalization has done to places like Washington State, where I live. It's touched my family, it's touched my friends. Nearly 50% of the kids I went to high school with are on the streets or dead. That's how bad it is in the particular town that I live in. But I believe in legalization. Not decriminalization, legalization. It is two very different things. I believe it for two reasons. Not because I believe it will solve all of our drug problems, but it certainly cannot be any worse than 50% of the people I went to high school with being on the street, addicted to fentanyl. And actually, most of them are addicted to meth and fentanyl. It can't get worse than that, literally. There is nothing stopping anybody in Washington State that wants to try drugs from trying drugs, except for themselves. And that's how it's meant to be in America. I don't believe that it will solve all the drug problems. I do think it will be better than abolition, which we have tried now for 100 years, and it has failed. Because as bad as decriminalization has been, criminalization was not a whole lot better. If we go back to pre-decriminalization, basically the time in which I was in high school, this area that I live, where now 50% of the people I went to high school with on the street, was about 30%, maybe 25%. So it was less, but it was far from zero. It was still far too much. And that's because decriminalization essentially just enables the drug use. It allows the criminal behavior to continue, but takes away any punishment. Where, of course, criminalization obviously allows the drug use, but adds punishment. But punishment that isn't effective. The fact is, if we are going to be a free country, even one that is guided by morals, people have the right to choose the things that they put into their body. That is first and foremost fundamental. as much as, we might not like it, there's no denying that. I mean, that is literally in the Bible, right? You have control over your body. And I understand that leftists twisted that argument to make it about abortion and another independent body. That's not the argument I'm making. You have domain over your own body. And the fact is, no matter how hard we try, we cannot get rid of the drugs anyway. We cannot stop people from taking them anyway. And so the best case scenario is to allow the legal commerce, because that immediately, overnight, guts cartels. What business do they have if they can't sell drugs, if there's no market for illegal drugs, because you can buy them legally? And now above board businesses can produce them like they produce every other drug that's legal on the market. And look, I'm not trying to give a windfall to Big Pharma, okay? But maybe this could actually allow the competition that is necessary to knock companies like Pfizer out of their controlling positions. There's not many other things that could generate such profit quick enough to help knock a company like Pfizer down than fentanyl. I understand that's not the best argument, but it is a fact. And so at the very least, even if you have the same amount of addicts at the end of the day, we're not spending hundreds of billions of dollars a year on enforcement that fails, on incarceration that fails, and punishing people for a personal choice. Now, not only did we destroy all of the criminal enterprise that goes along with it, we have freed up a ton of police to be able to, one, stop infringing on rights, because there's nothing, the war on drugs has primarily just led to expanded police rights that probably shouldn't exist, like asset forfeiture. So it frees them up to actually punish the crime that goes with drug use, because I don't want, and that's part of the problem with decriminalization, is, at least in places like Washington, is we ignore the petty crime that goes along with it because we take pity on these people. The shoplifting, the break, the minor B&Es, robbing. They don't treat those things very hard, and of course, it's too rampant for them to go after anyway, because they're too busy trying to take out a corner dealer that's making a couple $100 a week. I don't give a shit about the corner dealer making a couple $100 a week. Stop the junkie from breaking my window on my car for the 5th time to steal nothing. Frees up police to do that, and offers a source of tax revenue that can be used for treatment. Yes, more people might be willing to try drugs if they are available legally. I don't know what's stopping them now, but even so, okay. Doesn't mean more people are going to become addicted. Part of what made the opiate addiction so bad was taking away the legal prescriptions. They always talk about how evil it was for Purdue to market OxyContin. If it wasn't for the FDA lying for Purdue and saying that this was a miracle drug, nobody would have believed it. We knew what OxyContin was. We knew it was a derivative of Vicodin and of morphine, 2 drugs that had existed for 100 years, and people were very clear on what the abuse was. Nobody was confused. If it wasn't for the FDA giving Purdue legitimacy, yes, Purdue still would have lied, but nobody would have believed them. And then what happened? People started getting pissed about it. And so what did the FDA do? Okay, fine. Make it impossible to get it. That's what they did. So now you have millions of people, many of whom were legitimately helped by this drug. Because as much as we don't want to hear it, painkillers are in fact kind of miracle drugs. And what I mean by that is not that they don't have a dangerous side. Yes, abuse is a problem. But you can take a relatively high amount of opiates every day for 20 plus years. And the likelihood of side effects are lower than Tylenol or ibuprofen. The likelihood of serious complications from it. There are few medicines that you can take in high doses for that long of a period of time without a high probability of suffering seriously for it. In that sense, it is a miracle drug because a lot of people do in fact live in pain. And it does in fact make the quality of life of people in pain better. Maybe it's because that makes them high. Who are you to care? Who am I to care? As long as a doctor sees justification for it, and the patient is aware of the risks, and the doctor is, able and competent to call them out if they think that their patient is abusing the drugs or what have you, because there's a big difference between abuse and a need. I think part of the problem is a lot of people don't understand that if you're taking these drugs for an extended period of time, any time longer than 2 weeks, you cannot just stop taking it. It doesn't work that way. But that's what the federal government did. They just took it away. They made it virtually impossible to keep getting these drugs that anybody could get the day before overnight. Unless you were dying, it was basically impossible to get them legally from a doctor who is monitoring your intake of them. What does that do? That forces people to go and find it elsewhere. Because while I don't believe in this idea that you are born an addict, I get it. A lot of people don't like me for that belief, but I don't believe it. I don't believe that you are born an addict. Are some people more susceptible to becoming one? Maybe. But that could just be their personality rather than their genes. But I do know from what the best that I can understand that if somebody is taking these drugs for a long period of time and then just stop, in less than 24 hours, you go into what's called withdrawal, right? That's pretty well known. It is during that period of time that's what causes people to do crazy things. Because it's not them. It's not their brain, right? Their brain is hijacked temporarily. Now, it only lasts for so long, but they become willing to do things that they wouldn't be willing to do without that. Like buy drugs illegally. And so you had millions of people that were good people, hardworking people, cops, nurses, construction workers, productive members of society, that nobody even knew they were taking these drugs because it wasn't their business and because it was legal. That were then thrown in to this scenario. So what do? They start buying it illegally. And it just goes downhill from there. If we sell it legally, we can ensure it's not getting to kids, at least directly. Because I can tell you right now, there's nothing stopping it from getting to kids at all. And yes, kids still get their hands on cigarettes, but it's a hell of a lot harder. They honestly don't even try anymore. Mostly. Well, mostly they try the vapes now, but that's because the vapes became a lot easier to get for a period of time. But we've smartened up and started treating those more like cigarettes. Not that we should be taxing them like we were, but they should have always been, people shouldn't have been so willing to act like they were something different. I don't have a problem with, having to be 18. I do have a problem with constantly trying to lift the age up because you're either an adult with all your rights at 18 or you're not. So 18 should be the law across the board, no matter what it is, even alcohol. But but I don't have a problem with limiting things till the age of 18. And I certainly believe in making these drugs legal, that they shouldn't necessarily just be on the shelf next to the Robitussin, right? But they can be behind the counter in the pharmacy, like many other drugs are. Allergy medication is behind the counter. You shouldn't need a prescription for anything. If you want to take something that's going to kill you, if you want to, and not for the purpose of doing that, but something that is bad for you is what I meant. If you want to take something that is going to make you sick, if you want to take something that is going to help you, you shouldn't need permission to do it. Now, if you're a smart person, you should still go to a doctor and get a prescription. If you're a smart pharmacist, you shouldn't necessarily sell somebody something that is incredibly dangerous, like heart pills, without a reason, even if you don't need a prescription, because that's just the moral thing to do. But if somebody wants to, who is the government to tell us that we cannot access these things? We fundamentally view our government in the wrong way, I think. And people are scared of that freedom. Not usually for themselves, they're scared of other people having it. But you have to be man enough to recognize that's not your call. It's not my call what you are allowed to do and what you are not allowed to do. Now look, all of this comes with a caveat of requiring strong moral guidance. But what we don't seem to recognize is that we don't need the government to be the one to enforce it. Society can enforce it, and we used to. We used to have standards in our society. You were not accepted if you were lazy. You were not accepted if you were a piece of crap. You were not accepted for many reasons. Not because they were personal decisions, but because they were immoral decisions that hurt other people. And you were bullied for it, and you should have been. Because that bullying is what prevents the need for government to be involved. And we can see how well that's worked out. It doesn't. It can't. Everybody's got their own decisions to make, but like I said, we all think that time can't exist again, where people are truly free to make their own decisions, where you can walk into a pharmacy and buy heroin off the shelf if you want to. where nobody is checking up on whether or not you have permits from the state to distill some liquor in your backyard. It's for your personal use anyway. It seems like a world that can't exist again, but it can. And it's a world that existed not that long ago. We were still, I would say, 90% that America, the America that we all remember, the America that we all wish still existed. Basically, I would say our golden years are post-Civil War until the first progressive president. Until 1970. And look, that's not to say we didn't have problems, but I'm talking about the general approach to government. We made a lot of mistakes in the progressive era. We made a lot of mistakes with FDR during the Depression and World War II. But we largely retained our skepticism of government, our immense desire for them to stay out of the affairs of men until about the 1970s. And that's when it really started to switch over to what some would term the nanny state, where we tried to use the government to fix these problems. But the only thing that ends up doing is creating a government that just interferes with everybody. And don't get me wrong, our problem started around the year 1900. I'm not saying the 1970s was perfect. I'm saying we retained most of those freedoms. Up until about the year 1900, we had our maximum amount of freedom. From the founding of the country until then, it was only gaining freedoms. Unfortunately, we had our first progressive president in the year 1900. We had our worst progressive president a few years later with Woodrow Wilson, and then later with FDR. They set out to fundamentally transform the United States from a free individualist nation to a federally controlled nation, and they succeeded in doing so. The progressives today live on to carry that dream on further to a world government. That's the way that I see it. One of the ways that they've gone about that in the 21st century is by dividing us. Because people are not going to accept radical change unless they're unhappy. Happy people don't want things to change radically because they're happy with the way things are. And we'd be wise to recognize that. So, with that being said, what should you do? Well, there's a lot of things that you should do as an American and as a conservative American that wants to retain freedom and individualism and a free market and just generally a government that stays the hell out of your way and the hell out of your life. There's a lot of things. But the other thing that we need to recognize in this particular moment is in that division that they've created has been the rise, and these people have always existed, but they have never, I don't think, been anywhere near as successful as they are right now. And that's in part because people are unhappy, because we do have an extremely corrupt government. Progressives have managed to take control of enough of the system that if they lose control of a part of the system, like the presidency, they're still able to retain that control long term because they have the media. They have virtually every unappointed position in Congress or unelected position in Congress and most of the appointed ones. Most of the standard government employees. They run most of the major cities in the country, the port cities, the most important ones. I think I mentioned the media already, which of course you can't have a successful campaign without propaganda. The education, so that every child that is raised in America comes up with their propaganda, their indoctrination, as much as humanly possible. And they would have more if possible. If they could mandate that you had to give your child to the government the moment it was born until it was 18, they would do it. Remember Hillary Clinton? It takes a village. It doesn't take a village. It takes 2 dedicated parents. You don't need society to raise a child. But anyway, through all of these means and all of these unhappy people that they have tapped into, many of whom are Marxist believers, they're, they hate this country. They're American, but they hate the country. Not that they disagree with the size of the social safety net, not that they disagree with who's president right now. They hate this country. And that's not something that we can come to the middle on. Now, I'm not saying that's the majority of the left. The majority of the left could come back to sanity, could come back to agreeing on the fundamental principles of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. But for now, they're obviously unwilling to separate from their radicals. Either because they're convinced by the lies or I don't know what. I mean, there's lots of explanations, right? We've talked about many different things ourselves, and many other people put attention to that. That's not the point of tonight. The point is, the radicals exist, and there are a lot of people on the left that refuse to separate from that and are swayed by those arguments because they're unhappy enough to be swayed by them. My co-host and I got into an argument the other night because I said that, among other things, protests and even rallies, perhaps, were not an effective means of making change in this country. And I believe that. But that doesn't mean that organizing isn't. But I don't know that it needs to be on some grand scale to be effective. I certainly don't believe protests have any use. I don't have a problem with rallies. I'm not sure that they're greatly effective, though. And they open the door to a lot of danger, too, obviously, as we saw on January 6th. But organizing is important. And when I say organizing, how well do you know your neighbors? Do you know them at all? How well do you know the people in your community, in your town? How often do you go to PTA meetings, city council meetings? How often do you take your responsibility as an American seriously? Beyond just your four walls. If we don't want to see the end of the country we love, and in fact would like to see a bringing back of the country we love down the road, we have to start getting serious about it. Part of that is exercising your rights, including the Second Amendment. And no, that does not mean getting violent. It means being prepared for violence and not being able to be pushed around. That's two very different things. The left wants to be armed all of a sudden because they want to be able to attack things they don't agree with. That's not what I'm suggesting. You should be armed so that you can defend yourself from those kind of people. And being armed is only a small fraction of it. You should be armed with the correct equipment. And unfortunately, I believe that we live in a time where you have no choice, no matter how much you don't like it, no matter how much you don't care about it, to be sufficiently knowledgeable not just on weapons and how to use them, but on tactics. What do I mean by tactics? I mean things like knowing where the exits are in a building that you're in paying attention to your surroundings when you're out in public. I'm not talking about going around and playing army man. I'm talking about being a wise and capable man that is upholding his responsibility as an American. If we want the government to do less, we have to do more. We shouldn't be ungovernable. We should govern ourselves. If it were up to me, you would still be able to buy dynamite at the hardware store without ID. Maybe with ID. And that's only because we have so many people in the country that aren't legal. We are not hard enough on criminals, so we have a big problem with criminals and with mentally unwell people. Donald Trump, I don't know. I didn't look into this because I didn't plan on talking about it tonight, so it could have been an AI video, but I believe Donald Trump signed an executive order to bring back mental institutions. That might turn out to be one of the most important things he does. If it's true, if it's real. I can't promise that because, like I said, I didn't even look into it. I just saw a video. It very well could have been AI. But in the video, he said that he was signing an executive order to bring back mental institutions, and that he didn't want to have to do it, but it was necessary. I couldn't agree more. If that actually accomplishes something, that could be one of the most important things that he does. But the progressive left has been very good at demoralizing Americans. And that only stops when you stop letting it affect you. Stop being afraid of what they might do. Doesn't mean they might not do it anyway. Doesn't mean there's not a reason to fear that if you buy an assault rifle, you might become a felon tomorrow because you accidentally put the wrong grip on the front of it. Yes, it really is that easy to become a felon by owning a gun. But that's part of why you have a duty to not just own one, but to understand them, how they work, how to use one, what basic tactics are to use it safely and correctly and effectively. We have a moment of hope right now, but we don't have a guarantee. And if we want it to turn from a moment of hope into a guarantee, we need to start taking on more responsibility ourselves. We need to start holding our teachers' associations, our unions, our schools, and our city councils accountable. And that means showing up. Doesn't mean protesting, doesn't mean being violent. Just means showing up, putting pressure on them, and letting them know that the people are not happy and they're not going to tolerate it anymore. They keep doing what they're doing because nobody's bothering them about it. You have teachers that are radicalizing your children, turning them in to agitators instead of teaching them arithmetic. You have people flying foreign flags in your streets, telling you, you have no right to this land, I do. Last I checked, it was my father and my grandfather and my great-grandfather and yours that built this country. We don't owe anybody anything. And we don't have to have a justification when we say enough. We don't have to justify that immigration is harmful to the American citizen in order to say no more. We need no justification whatsoever. There are plenty. We have them, but we don't need them. We have every right to determine who comes into this country and who doesn't. We have every right to kick people out of this country that have absolutely no right to be here. We have every right to say the Supreme Court has interpreted the 14th Amendment incorrectly, and that's evident by its plain text and reading, and that's evident by the words of the men that wrote the amendment. Just because two illegals have a child on American soil does not make that child a citizen. We're sorry you were led to believe that. It's never been the case. We're not going to let it be now. If the Supreme Court comes back and says, no, that is what it says, fine, change the amendment. We have a process for doing it. Demand it. It's an absurd idea. It cannot possibly be true. Because that means if we're invaded by a foreign military, they don't have to come with guns. They don't have to come with anything because we can't kick them out without giving them due process first. That's absurd. They can just come and stand here, have kids, and now they're just as American as you, even though they're an invading army. It never has, it doesn't, and it can't work that way. And we need not justify it. If the Supreme Court refuses to uphold the obvious, change the amendment. Demand that it gets changed. Show up to the court, or not the courthouse, but your state house every single day until they adopt the constitutional amendment to change it. Quit paying your taxes. Do whatever it takes that is peaceful. But we have to do it together. It's not just unless we all agree that it's just. And if they're not going to protect our children, back to the gun thing for a minute, we have to be prepared to. I don't care if the vast majority of mass shooters are trans or not. I don't care if they're bunnies. It doesn't matter who they are. They should get nothing but 2 bullets in the front of the head. Period. Mass shooters should be terrified of the average citizen, not the other way around. And there is nothing unjust in believing that. There's nothing wrong or immoral about believing that. All right. We've been going for a little over an hour and a half now. I think I'm going to call it tonight since we started so late. But I will be back on tonight, more normal time, like 6, 7 o'clock West Coast time. Follow the X channel to find out when we go on, and I'll have a normal show prepared. Like I said, this is a different show. Just because I wanted to make sure something got on, but I didn't prepare anything. Besides the Coolidge speech just before I went on, anyway. Happy President's Day. Try to remember, if you're upset about Trump about certain things, and there are reasons to be, like the fact he hasn't fired Pam Bondi, or Kash Patel, or Kristi Noem. Try to remember, it has only been a year. Give him a little bit of grace. A little bit. And don't allow giving up any ground in Congress this November. Because if we do, then the last 6 years, I mean, not Biden's years, but, the first 4 years of Trump, the first 2, and then the last 4, they'll be completely useless and meaningless. Nothing has been permanently changed, and without Congress, we cannot permanently change it. We need an overwhelming majority in order to do that. Further, the more angry that the left gets, the more kind you need to get. Prepared to defend yourself, the more strong you need to be, but the more restrained that you need to be. Credibility matters. When nobody has any, it's the most valuable thing you can have. Be an honest person, mean what you say, and do what you say. That's all you have to do. Tell the truth. Don't be an asshole. We can be opposed to illegal immigrants. We can be opposed to everything that the left does without being assholes about it. Doesn't mean we have to budge an inch. I'm not saying be agreeable. I'm not saying be a doormat. You can be as firm as humanly possible and still not be an asshole. We got to remember that. x.com/JBU_show. That's the best place to go to find out when we're going to be live. JBU.Show on Rumble, on X, and on YouTube. And of course, you can listen to audio podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, anywhere that podcasts are. And visit anchor.fm/JBU for all the links and the archive for the audio podcast. Rumble is the best place for the archive for the video podcast. I think for tonight, that's it. So with that, my name is Chris, and this has been the JBU Show.